It was an ordinary Monday morning. I took my mother-in-law shopping to Marks & Spencer's in Lakeside. We had lunch out. I took her home. I wrote some Easter cards. Then I suddenly got the onset of a headache. Unusual for me, I rarely get any aches and pains. I said to my husband David, who was at home, I'm going to lie down for a couple of minutes. I took 2 paracetamol. Then as soon as I got upstairs, I have what the NHS describe as a thundercrack headache. I have never felt pain like it. I felt that my head and the back of my neck were going to explode. I asked David to come upstairs. I asked him to phone for an ambulance, and then I passed out, and I can remember very little for the next 5 days. First, I was taken to Basildon, but then I was transferred to Queen's Hospital, as they have a specialist neurology department. There, I was diagnosed with having a substantial subarachnoid bleed, which is a brain hemorrhage, likened to a stroke. My condition suddenly deteriorated, and David was rung at 11 o'clock at night to say I was being transferred to intensive care. The consultant told him they were between a rock and a hard place. If they couldn't get my blood pressure up, I'd have another stroke. If my blood pressure went too high, the bleed on my brain would restart. To David, at least, who'd read up about my condition, it seemed my life was in the balance. David convinced himself I wasn't coming home, but he is a catastrophic thinker. I was bedbound and attached to multiple drips for 2 weeks. I was also very sleep deprived, as the lights are on 24 hours a day in intensive care, and my medication was given every 2 hours, 24 hours a day. So if I slept, it was for a maximum of 60 minutes at a time, and even sleep for that long was unusual. Very early on, I made a conscious decision to put my faith totally in God. Whether I lived or died, I knew I was choosing God to be with me every step of the way. Many miracles were already happening around me. First of all, Roger sent my husband David Psalm 121 and asked David to read it to me. My David, he won't mind me saying, would not describe himself as a Christian, but he insisted on reading verses 1 to 8 of Psalm 121 at the start and end of each hospital visit. In my wildest dreams, I had never imagined David reading Bible verses to me. Those repeated readings were really precious, and the word protection, help, guard at night stayed in my mind after David left. After a week, David brought into hospital a slightly old-fashioned card with a selection of prayers and Bible verses that an elderly friend had sent. The verses on it were from Philippians 4. You probably know them. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. It was at that point I was overwhelmed with God's presence and spirit, and a sense of peace that did transcend all understanding. I felt it was a message from God. When I closed my eyes, the card was the last thing I saw, and when I opened my eyes, I really did feel God's spirit fill me with joy as I was reminded that God was literally by my side. As I reached out to God, I felt his presence more tangibly. As James says in chapter 4, come near to God and God will come near to you. A week after I'd been in hospital, David sent out a message at 6:20 to Roger and all my Christian friends, saying that although he'd had a good visit to see me in hospital that day, there was still no news about when my brain surgery would go ahead. 2 hours later, David had a call from my surgeon saying they were going to operate the next day. I'm convinced that the surgeon's phone call that night was a direct answer to intercessory prayer from Tuesday Zoom's prayer group and the prayers of my family and friends. Time and again throughout my recovery, I have had such a strong sense of people praying for me. I have been overwhelmed by the sense that people are on this journey with me. Unlike at the start of COVID, I made a conscious decision in hospital not to research subarachnoid hemorrhage on the internet or the long-term effects of having this type of brain bleed, to focus on God rather than worldly advice. David kindly started to read out what the NHS said about my condition sometimes being fatal and having long-term side effects, but I stopped him. I decided I would trust God instead and take things day by day. I don't always get it right, but I believe I've been given a second chance at life, and I want to use it to serve well. The consultant wrote to me this month to say I'd made a remarkable recovery. I think of it as a miraculous recovery, due in part to a wonderful NHS, but more importantly, as James 5 says, because the prayers of faithful people have a powerful effect. Thank you very much.